Shalom Aleichem. Today is Tishrei, Tavshin Pei Wow, corresponding to the 29th of September 2025 according to the Gregorian calendar. Someone mentioned this vile Haredi politician by the name of Moshe GAFNI. He's truly vile. I say that with full intent and deliberation. After deliberation, Moshe GAFNI is vile, shallow, and ignorant. Let's start with that. That's not a great beginning. But having said that, for those who don't know, we're talking about a certain gentleman. He's not a Rav. Let's not misuse and cheapen the term Rav by preferring on him a smicha all of a sudden. Technically, I have no idea, but he's goy asum v'rav. Ze what ken. Rav lo. Or as a certain Rosh Yeshiva that I heard about once, when he heard about a certain Talmid who at one time learned in his yeshiva, and he was a very poor student, and he has somehow become a rabbi and then became the rabbi of a certain community. This was in England, as I understand the story. This is how it was told to me. I was not there. The Rosh Yeshiva said, regarding the fact that this person was now a rabbi, he said, "Vayismoch yodo al rosh hapar." All right. So, as efshar, kol davar efshar leasmich, or lismoch. Letzareno today it means very little. So, what's the problem with someone like Moshe GAFNI? You can say anything you like about him, because most of the terrible things you might say would be true. But we should not take him to task without taking his Rabbanim to task. He learnt the various ideas and attitudes that he professes. He learned these things from somewhere. He didn't make them up. So if he claims today in the current situation, we just have to end the war. What does that mean? I have no idea. Do you just end the war, and what happens then? I mean, we had rockets fired at Ashkelon and Ashdod just a few days ago. You can imagine what would happen within days or weeks of such a ceasefire, so-called. You can just imagine. And we have to end the war now, and we have to bring home all the hostages. So he says, correct? And why is this? Because it's pikuach nefesh. All right. Well, why should I take this particular individual to task when Harav Yitzchak Yosef, who knows a great deal more than he does, says exactly the same thing, and he says it loudly and clearly. Now, someone just mentioned here, I heard him say it half a year ago in a recorded Shiur. Now, someone just told me that he said it again the other day. I'm not surprised, because that's what he really thinks. If you ask yourself, why is this the case? In other words, how could any Hacham say or think such a thing? Well, that's an excellent question, because it's really outlandish. But if you nevertheless try and understand it, and you listen to what they say, and you actually read, for instance, the Psak Halacha of the father of Yitzchak Yosef, Harav Ovadia Yosef Zetzal. And again, I stress, both Rav Ovadia Yosef and Harav Yitzchak Yosef are very knowledgeable in many areas of Torah. Tremendous bikiyuth, and many of the things they say, I would most certainly, Ani HaKatan I would agree with. But some of the things they say are so blatantly inane and opposed to what the Torah states plainly, and also stand in opposition to anything you could define as common sense. Well, there's a problem. We obviously therefore have a big problem. And the first thing to remember is that the national calamity and disaster and tragedy known as the Oslo Accords would not have become a reality were it not for the fact that Rabbi Ovadia Yosef at that time, we're talking now 32 years ago. Exactly, 32 years ago the Oslo Accords were signed. He was in favor of them. Most people, by the way, have not actually read. I mean, take Rabbi Yosef, he wrote a long psak halacha on the subject. Why Shtachim Tmurat Shalom is an acceptable and correct idea. Few people have actually bothered to read what he writes. If you do, you see exactly how the only person who took that psak halacha seriously, that is to say, took it line by line, analyzed it, and refuted absolutely every word there, literally, is Hagaon Rav Eliyahu Rahamim Zini from Haifa. He wrote a whole book on the subject, which I have, in which he quotes the entire psak halacha of Rabbi Yosef, word for word, doesn't leave out a line, and he refutes it line by line. That's the book. And if a person actually looks at that material, you understand how completely correct Rav Zini is and how completely wrong Rabbi Yosef was. And what's the essential issue? First of all, I'll give first a common sense and a common sense argument based on objective and obvious facts. If you claim that the Jewish people, this could also be in Chutz La'aretz, by the way. It doesn't have to be here in Eretz Yisrael. It could be in the Jewish Pale of settlement in Russia, where you have a large area which is settled mainly by Jews or exclusively by Jews, and the same kind of offer was made to them by the surrounding hostile goyim. But of course, we'll take the case of Eretz Yisrael. Jews living in Eretz Yisrael. We have enemies both in our midst, which is another problem, which needs to be discussed and to be dealt with. And we also have goyim, enemies who surround us. And they say to us, so says Rabbi Yosef, they say to us, well, if we want you to return this part of Eretz Yisrael that you currently occupy, return it to us. And if you do not, we will go to war. Rabbi Yosef's claim was that, seeing that in warfare people die, and if we acquiesce to this demand, then we can prevent the death of Jews, supposedly, that's the theory. So therefore it's a question of pikuach nefesh, and pikuach nefesh doche kol haTorah kula, except for three specific things, as we know: avodah zarah, gilui arayot, shefichut damim. And therefore we must agree to this demand, and we must hand over this part of whatever it is that they're demanding of Eretz Yisrael. But again, you could transpose this entire discussion and that argument and that halachic reasoning to the Jewish Pale of settlement in Russia. It doesn't have to be in Eretz Yisrael, because Eretz Yisrael doesn't factor as the fact that it's Eretz Yisrael, that there's a miswal of Yerusha Fa'aretz, etc. It doesn't factor in any of Rabbi Yosef's discussion. It's just not there. But all right, so that's what he says. Well, you understand, of course, that any person would understand that if you agree to such a proposition, then the next day or the next year or 10 years later or 50 years later, the same enemy, goyim, or others who have now taken their place, they can come along and say exactly the same thing to you. All right, well, just as those people demanded this territory and you gave it to them to prevent bloodshed, we now demand this territory over here. B'kitzur, if you follow this halachic reasoning, so-called, it's only a matter of time until the Jews find themselves in the sea. Correct? Because every time it's a question of pikuach nefesh, they keep pushing you back without firing a shot. They just say, we will go to war if you do not hand this territory over to us. We ask the Rav says, you must do so because it's pikuach nefesh. Well then, by definition, the Jewish people cannot exist in any piece of territory anywhere on earth. Again, in Eretz Yisrael Vadai, and also anywhere else for that matter. By definition, it cannot be. what would someone like Rabbi Yosef or Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef, his son, what would they say in response? They would say, yeah, that's true. So what? Who says we need to be sovereign, independent in any particular territory, anywhere on the planet at the present time? When the Mashiach comes, it'll be different, and then we'll do this, and then we'll think that way, and we might act that way, and then Hashem will help us, or when we won't have enemies, and we won't need an army even. And by the way, the same Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef in the Shiur that I heard a recording of stated, and we mentioned this in a Shiur months ago, that in the time of David HaMelech, when he fought Am Yisrael's enemies, there were no soldiers were killed, and none even were injured. Very interesting. And as you may recall, I pointed out that in Sefer Melachim, Aleph Perek Yod Zayin, we hear that in the war of David HaMelech, in which Uriah Hitti participated, many soldiers did die. And it wasn't just, that's a particular incident that is mentioned there in the Tanakh explicitly, but obviously this happened many other times as well. And I quoted a Midrash Tehillim, where it says that Kol ha'alafim shemetu b'milchama b'zman David HaMelech, it was because they didn't demand the Binyan Bet HaMikdash, but from this you understand that everyone knows that people were dying at that time. So this claim has nothing to do, neither with common sense, nor with the Torah sources, not with the Tanakh, not with the Midrash, not with anything. So, the Mehila Mikavodam, I have no choice but to refer to such Torah as Alice in Wonderland Torah. It's fairy tales. It's nothing to do with Torah, it's just fairy tales. If they actually believe such stories that they tell their students, then it's truly beyond belief. It's beyond belief. So, that being the case, why would I expect someone like Moshe GAFNI or any other political askan in the Haredi world today, or I don't know what various Rabbanim in the Haredi world think today, I'm not sure. I know what Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef thinks because he said so, and it's recorded, and was repeated apparently. So we know what Rav Zilberstein, or Rav Landau, or Rav Hirsch, or Rav whoever it might be, thinks on this or that point. I do not know. I'm not claiming that I know what everyone says about every possible question, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of them may say the same thing. But I know that Rabbi Yosef said it, I know that Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef says it today, despite everything that happened, and this is also despite the fact that Rabbi Yosef apparently learnt his lesson the hard way. We paid the price, really, more than he did, because he supported Oslo, but when it came to Sharon's crime against the Jewish people and the withdrawal from Gaza, Rabbi Yosef refused to support that. Shas voted against it on his explicit orders. All of a sudden, and he was asked why, and he said because they will just attack us from there. Correct? Good morning. Where were you? Where were you a few years ago? A couple of decades? Where were you? What, you didn't know that before? What has changed? Nothing has changed. So somehow he was blinded by his own flawed halachic reasoning, which I will get to in a moment, why it's flawed from its inception. But he saw the reality on the ground. He saw what happened in the wake of those Oslo Accords, and he refused to go along with it again with regards to Gaza. And he refused to support Sharon's plan. And that's why Sharon had to bribe Agudat Yisrael with hundreds of millions of shekel of money for yeshivot, most of which some they never received, by the way, just for the record. Asher Yeminam Yemin Shaker, Asher Pihem Diber Sho Yeminam Yemin Shaker. He had to bribe Agudat Yisrael, etc., with money for yeshivot, in order for them to go along with the so-called hitnatkut, with the destruction of Gush Katif and the destruction of the lives of not just the 9,000 Jews who lived in Gaza at that time, which was a flourishing, successful several communities of Jews in Gaza at that time, but it had a knock-on effect which affected the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. And of course, in the long run, it's now affected all of us. And that what happened 2 years ago could not have happened without what Sharon did, obviously. And what Sharon did couldn't have happened were it not for Oslo. People tend to forget the reality, the facts. The Israeli army withdrew, for the most part, from Rifat Azza, from the Gaza Strip, not as a result of Sharon's crimes, but way back in Tawshin Nundarid, 1994, immediately after the Oslo Accords. Most of the army withdrew from most of Azza at that time. And that's, of course, when you began to have mortar shells and rockets, both in Gush Katif and beyond Gush Katif. That's when it began. Before that, things were relatively calm. As calm as things can be when you're surrounded by Islam and Nazis, but relatively calm. Sorry?
GAFNI doesn't have, sorry to put it this way, its own Rabbonim, its own Rabbonim.
I do not know, nor do I care. Because I hear the things that he says. I hear and I see the disdain and the shallowness and the rishuth. I don't care. Someone just mentioned that perhaps I misspoke, or maybe the facts are not that Rav Yitzchak Yosef repeated it, but it's known what he says. It's recorded. I've heard it recorded on camera, live. No question what he said. So first of all, he's probably said it more than once. I heard it once. The person who repeated it more recently was this Moshe GAFNI individual. Fine. But it makes no difference. It's the same kind of inane thinking, if you can call it thinking at all, because it's totally irrational in every possible way. Now, what is the essence of the Psak Halacha of Rabbi David Yosef about what was called once upon a time Shtahim Tmurat Shalom, land for peace? What was his logic? That it's Pikuach Nefesh, as we explained. There's only one problem, and that is that the halakha to which he refers, namely that, I'm sorry, can I have the Rambam, Chelik Aleph? I'll quote it from the Rambam, why not? In Ilchot Yesodei HaTorah, Perek Hamishi, Rabbeinu HaGadol Rambam says as follows. He says, Kol Bet Yisrael Methuim Al Kiddush Hashem HaGadol Hazeh. All Jews are required in certain circumstances to sanctify Hashem's name. In other words, be willing to forfeit their lives rather than transgress a particular aspect of the Torah, which as we're about to explain. So Rambam says, if an evil doer, this could be a non-Jew, it could be an evil Jew, there are such people as well, unfortunately. And there are names for such people. Minim, Kofrim B'Torah, Erev Rav, etc. B'shashi Amor Goy, where Noset Yisrael La'avor Alahat Mikol Mitzvot Ha'amurot B'Torah O Yahargeno. So it usually would be a Gentile, but it might not be. You must transgress this particular thing we want you to do. We want you to Halal Shabbat. We want you to cook us a stew right now on Shabbat. And if not, we'll kill you. What should he do? Rambam says, Ya'avor, Ulo Yarech, he should cook this stew for these evil people on Shabbat, rather than be killed. Even though Shabbat is one of the most serious and most central mitzvot of the Torah. Nevertheless, that's the halakha. Rambam didn't make this up, we all know. This is explicit sugyot in the Talmud. Shene'emar b'mitzvot asher ya'aseh otam ha'adam wa hay b'hem, Ulo she'emut b'hem. Not only that, if he decided to be a grace tzaddik and not do so, he's hayav al nafsho, then he allowed himself to be killed. When is this the case? In the case of these particular three averot, Avodah Zarah, anything to do with Avodah Zarah, anything to do with Gilui Arayot, and anything to do with Shafichut Damim. Gilui Arayot is sexual promiscuity or illicit sexual relations, and Shafichut Damim is bloodshed. For example, if a Jew is told, you kill that Jew over there, or we'll kill you, that's Shafichut Damim. He has to say, I won't do it. Avar Shalosh Avirot Elu, Im Yomar Lo Avor Al Ahat Mehen or Tehareg, Yareg Wal Yavor. That's the halakha. Beseder Gamur. And this is only true when Sha'agoy mitkawen lahanat asmo. In other words, he wants you to cook a stew on Shabbat because he wants to eat a stew on Shabbat and he wants you to do it for him. But if his intention, he's doing it dafka to force the Jew to transgress the Torah, not because he wants the stew, but he knows that it's a soul for the Jew to cook this stew on Shabbat, and he therefore insists that the Jew do it. If it's in private, then he may do so. But if he makes it into a public display, then it's a Hilul Hashem Gadol, because this is we're talking here about Kiddush Hashem in this Perek. Even if you only told him to eat this ham sandwich, it's only a miswat lo ta'aseh, only, chamur, ma'od, but it's a miswat lo ta'aseh, it's not isur karet, it's not isur bitaf be'edin. Nevertheless, if he's told him to do this in front of other Jews, in order to show that the Jews are not going to be able to continue to live as Jews, and they will do as we say, then he has to be willing to lay down his life. That's the miswah of Kiddush Hashem. All right, what does this halakha discuss? What is the situation? We have a particular Jew, his name is Yossi Kohen, or Chaim Shmerel, it doesn't matter, and he's told by this evil person, Goy or not, or Jew, you must transgress this aspect of the Torah, or I will kill you. What is the response? Well, we just saw, it depends on the situation, depends on the details. But this is talking about an individual. This is talking about an individual Jew whose life is now in the balance. Either he will acquiesce or he will not acquiesce. Either he will do what he's being forced to do, or he will not do what he's forced to do, depending on what the halakha states. Hopefully, that will be his response. We're talking about the individual life of an individual Jew. What has this got to do with the life of the Jewish nation? What has this got to do with the current existence of the Jewish people in the present and in the future? The answer is there's nothing to do with that. That's a totally different circumstance. This halakha that we just read from, that Rabbi Yosef bases his psak halakha on, is based on this halakha here, which is dealing with individuals. The individual Jew who is in a given situation is being threatened, his life is being threatened, and the halakha discusses how he should respond. This has nothing to do with the Jewish people, whether they should fight or not fight for their national sovereign existence, whether they are commanded or not commanded to control and inherit Eretz Yisrael and bequeath it to their children and to the generations to come. There's nothing to do with that. In other words, what am I saying? It's very simple. Rabbi Yosef and his son Rabbi Tzak Yosef, and anyone else who agrees with this line of thinking, it doesn't make a difference who it is. No one should think I'm mentioning them because they're Sfaradim and I have something against Sfaradim. Nothing could be further from the truth. There are plenty of Ashkenazi Rabbanim. I just don't know off the top of my head which name to quote, whom to mention, but it makes no difference. Anyone who thinks along these lines is completely in error. And why? Because they do not understand that there is a huge difference between a Yahid and a Klal. There is Klal Yisrael and there's a Yahid B'Yisrael. There's a Prat, there's a Yahid, and there's a Klal. This is so basic, so obvious. For example, if I read another halakha to you in the Rambam, this time from Yichot Shabbat, Perek Sheni. This is not even in Hilchot Melachim or Milhamot. It's not necessarily when there's a Jewish king and a Jewish government. It's not necessarily in Eretz Yisrael. This halakha that I'm about to quote to you appears in the Shulchan Aruch as well. It's based on the Gemara in Masechet Eruvin. And what does it say here in Perek Sheni? Halakha towards the end of the Perek, Halakha Kaf given in this edition at least. Goyim shesaru al Ayaroth Yisrael. enemies of the Jews, Goyim, begin to approach or to surround Jewish towns or cities or what have you on Shabbat. And it's clear they didn't come to visit and to deliver flowers or something. They came to do evil of some kind. So the question is, what kind of evil? If we have reason to believe, we have good reason to believe, to be convinced that all they want to do is steal and pillage and plunder, so to translate into modern terms, we know that these particular Bedouin, all they really want to do is steal a couple of cars. That's what they do. That's a parnosa. Everyone needs to have a parnosa. That's what they do. Or you steal tractors or whatever, or agricultural equipment, whatever it is. That's iskem mamon. And mahalalim aleim et Shabbat. You don't go to war on Shabbat because of the tractor. Wa'en osim imahem milchama. We don't go to war. However, ba'ir has-samucha las-safar, if this happens in a town, in an area which is on the border between the Jewish area and the non-Jewish area. In other words, there's an area where Jews live. Again, it can be in Eretz Yisrael, hopefully it is, and it may be in the Jewish Pale of Settlement in Russia, or in who knows where. If it's on that border area, afilu lo ba'u al iskei teven v'kash, yos'im alehen bichlei zayin u'mahalim alehem et ha-Shabbat. Do you have Masechet Eruvin handy? It says here in the Talmud, Bavli, Eruvin, Memhe, Amud Aleph, Omar Rav, נוכרים שסרו על עיירות ישראל אין יוצאים עליהם בכלי זינון ואין מאכלים עליהם את השבת. תניא נומי אחרי נוכרים שסרו, etc. the same statement. באמת דברים אמורים כשבאו על עסקי ממון, אבל באו על עסקי נפשות. In other words, we know that their intention is to kill, not just to steal. יוצאים עליהם בכלי זינון ומחללים עליהם את השבת. ובעיר הסמוכה לספר, אפילו לא באו על עסקי נפשות. Even if it's a border area, and from what we know, they only intend to pillage and plunder, אלא על עסקי תבן וקש, just to steal hay and straw, יוצאים עליהם בכלי זינם ומחללים עליהם את השבת. Rashi, Rabbeinu Shlomo says, Rashi says, ספר לספר, עיר שמבדלת בין גבול ישראל לגבול האומות, יוצאים עליהם. Why? שמא ילכדוה ומשם תהא נוחה הארץ לכבש לפניהם. In other words, you're opening up the door, you're opening up the gate for the goyim to figure out, especially if we come on Shabbat, these Jews won't fight. So we can just grab this place now, and we'll be able, from there, we'll be able to continue penetrating into their territory. We'll be able to conquer, we'll be able to steal more, and whatever it is, you're just going to encourage them. And you are endangering all the Jews living in this area, because maybe today they only came to plunder and to steal your tractor and your car, but maybe the next time they'll be more mahader b'miswa, and they'll want to on ala derech, why not kill some Jews as well? So this is in the Talmud Bavli. This has nothing to do with Eretz Yisrael. Doesn't say anything about Eretz Yisrael here. Rashi, when Rashi said Shema umisham tehen haaretz likavesh lifnehem, doesn't mean dafka in Eretz Yisrael. It can be in Bavel. Rav was in Bavel a lot of the time, at least, and this halacha is, as I said, it's in the Torah, it's in the Shulchan Aruch, it's in the Rif, it's everywhere. It's not nothing to do with Eretz Yisrael, Tzionut, Geula, Atalta de Geula, Ikva Demeshicha, nothing to do with any of that. It has to do with Yichol Shabbat. That's why in the Rambam it's in Yichol Shabbat, Perek Sheni. Alright, so Rambam continues. So if it's in a Ezor Sfar on the border, Im Baal Iskei Nefashot, or She'alchu, or B'chol Makom, and whatever the case may be, in the border area, even if we know they only came to plunder, or B'chol Makom, Im Baal Iskei Nefashot, if we know they came to kill, or She'alchu Milchama, or She'saru Stam. In other words, they just show up and they're armed. They're obviously intending to attack or to besiege us. Yos'im alehem b'chlei zayin u'mahalim alehem et ha-Shabbat. That's the halacha. U'miswa al kol Yisrael she'cholim lavo, and every Jew in that area, in that region, who is able to come on Shabbat, latzeth u'la'azor lahihem who are now under siege or under attack. Ulhasilam miyad hagoyim b'Shabbat, every Jew is mitzuveh, is commanded to do so. وَأَصُولَ لَهِمْ لَهِثْمَهَمَا لَمُوسَى Shabbat. They're not allowed to wait till Mosei Shabbat. Okay. Well, why don't we ask ourselves a question? Why do you fight such people? Why don't you, for instance, run away? Thus you would achieve the purpose of pikuach nefesh. No, you would avoid bloodshed. No one can be killed if you run away fast enough. Then there'll be no pikuach nefesh. And you're telling a Jew from the town next door, when he hears the shofar being blown on Shabbat, to warn that or today nowadays there'll be the message will go out on everyone's phones and on the public address system, what have you. Everyone will know that this town over here next door is being attacked by oivim, by enemies. Why are all Jews told to go and save them? What about pikuach nefesh? And this is even if it's al miskem mamon, even kash v'teven, if it's be'ezor hasfar, on the border. So because of kash and teven, Jews are going to risk their lives, and some Jews may well be killed and maimed, injured, what have you, because of kash v'teven on Shabbat. What about pikuach nefesh? In other words, you see plainly, such talk is nonsense. It's inane. It's almost beneath contempt to have to discuss it. What's the problem with such rabbanim? They don't understand that there's a klal, there are inyanei klal and tzibur and Am Yisrael, even in Chutz La'aretz. Again, it's in the Shulchan Aruch, which is written for Bazman Hazeh, Bazman HaGalut, and that's the halacha. So how can you say that when these goyim over here say, if you don't give us this land, we're going to go to war with you? How can you use the concept of pikuach nefesh to say we should acquiesce to such a thing? It's clearly nonsense. It's truly drivel. It's drivel. It's absolute nonsense. What we see clearly, therefore, that certain rabbanim who think along these lines are living in a reality of galuth. Well, actually, no, even that's not true, because we just explained this halakha that even applies to galuth. But they only see the individual Jew. They cannot see anything beyond the individual Jew. Even though, again, this halakha speaks about even galuth, and it's in the Shulchan Aruch, and it's in the Mishnah Berurah, and it's in the Hayy Adam, and it's in the Ben Ish Chai. It's everywhere. They can't see beyond the somehow the individual Jew trumps everything else. And then you can understand that a nobody like Moshe GAFNI comes along and says that we have to end the war tomorrow and bring all the hostages back. That's what the Torah tells us to do. Well, again, he heard this somewhere. He didn't make it up. He's a tipesh and a rasha for repeating such nonsense, but which in itself causes harm and damage to the Jewish people. But he heard it somewhere. There were greater people than he who said such things. Correct? So such thinking is completely, in every way, the opposite of what the Torah teaches. And we also see with our own eyes the outcome, the result of following such advice. As we said before, without Rav Yosef there would not have been Oslo. Without Oslo there couldn't have been Sharon's criminal acts against the Jewish people and inane policy of destroying Gush Katif and fleeing from Gaza. And without that, then we wouldn't have held the rockets and missiles for the past 20 years from Gaza, and we wouldn't have had this current war. And we're not out of the woods yet by any means. And I expressed before my lack of confidence and my lack of expectation that Netanyahu will end up with will not produce that he will produce the correct result. I don't think that he will. So the price the Jewish people pays for such anti-Torah thinking is immense. It's beyond words. All right, so that's as far as that goes.
Regarding what you're quoting about the story you're referring to in a galut situation of being attacked, do those halachot presume a situation of milchemet mitzvah even there, or is it
I'm sorry, once again?
Does that presume
what
that halacha of when you're being attacked
on Shabbat?
In the
Yes.
That the only way of understanding that is in the context of milchemet mitzvah, or one can understand that sugya in the context of lo tamar moyacha.
Well, that's actually an interesting question, because I need the other volume. Because in Yichot Melachim Milchamoth, Perek Hamishi, Rambam discusses Milchemet Miswa, and he gives three definitions of Milchemet Miswa, correct? The three definitions are the leader of the Jewish people, the king, normally would be a king, is required to fight the wars of the Jewish people. And before he goes off and undertakes various other military campaigns or policies or initiatives, first of all he has to deal with what is defined as a milchemet miswa. So what is a milchemet miswa? פרק חמישי הלכה א', ואיזו היא מלחמת מסווה, זו מלחמת שבעת עממים, ומלחמת עמלק, ועזרת ישראל מסר שבא עליהם. These three types of מלחמת מסווה are as follows. שבעת עממים, literally the 7 nations that inhabited Eretz Canaan in the time of Moshe and Yoshua. And a person might think, therefore, this doesn't apply today. I would most definitely reject that idea. Just as it applied then, it applies now. Because if any other nation takes the place of those Shivat Hamamim and says, this is our country, this is our nation, you don't belong here, and we will fight you tooth and nail, and we will not allow you to live here, etc. They're Shivat Hamamim, they have the same halachic status. I'm not the first person to suggest this. You can find this idea mentioned in the Abarbanel. You can Rabbi David HaKohen HaNazir, Talmid of Rav Kook, speaks about this explicitly, and it's common sense when you think about it. Otherwise, if you don't say such a thing, then essentially what you're doing is turning the Torah into some kind of anachronistic historical document. We're learning once upon a time there was a Milchama, Shivat Hamamim. Now, but it doesn't exist. Okay, what's the next one? Milchemet Amalek. Well, some people think the same thing again. I don't want to mention names, but I heard recently a certain Rav say that he was talking about building the Mikdash, and this particular individual says that in order to build the Mikdash you first need a king, a melech, which is wrong, but that's what he thinks, because that's what Rav Tzvi Kook taught him. And he says, and before you build the Mikdash, because he's opposed to anything to do with Har HaBayit today, he was explaining why people who go to Har HaBayit are terrible, and they're criminals, and they're insulting the Jewish people, and all these kinds of things. Okay, fine. And you have to understand, this person has a large kippah struga on his head, not a black kippah. Okay, but so you see the various forms of insanity are contagious. So he says you need a king, and you also need to get rid of Amalek first before you can have a Mikdash. That's what he thinks. And he says we don't know who Amalek is, and therefore we need a Navi to tell us who Amalek is, otherwise we can't do it. Who's Amalek? Do you know who Amalek is? So we can't do it, so we're stuck. This is what this particular individual said. Well, he's completely wrong, 100% wrong. The halachic definition of Amalek is any Oyev Mushba of Am Yisrael who declares openly, or if he doesn't declare, if we know it to be the case, that his aim is to destroy and eliminate the Jewish people. That is Amalek. That has any group, nation, organization, terrorist group, it doesn't matter, tribe of people who have, that is their aim, that is what drives them. you want a simple example, I don't even have to mention Azar. You could mention the Teimanim, the Houthim in Teiman. They're a long way from here, correct? 2,000 plus kilometers. We have no direct conflict with them, you would think, and yet they're dedicated to firing ballistic missiles at us on a fairly regular basis. Now, how can that be understood as anything but an insatiable and inexorable thirst for Jewish blood? How can that be understood in any other way? And they pay a price for this as well, but that doesn't matter to them. And they say openly, it doesn't matter, we'll continue. Which is true. This is why the only possible, that's exactly why the mitzvah is Mehiyat Amalek, to wipe them out, because there's nothing else to do, because they won't stop. So, if you take the incorrect approach, then you understand that Shivat HaMamim is an ancient historical concept, has nothing to do with today. Well, you got rid of one of these mitzvot, Milchamot mitzvah. If you think the same about Milchamet Amalek, then that's gone as well. So what are you left with? Not very much. Well, you're left with Ezrat Yisrael Misal Sheba'alehem. So the question is, this is what Binyamin asked. So when Goyim attack Jews on Shabbat, either in Eretz Yisrael or in Russia or wherever it might be, is that a Mehereth Miswa of Ezrat Yisrael Misal Sheba'alehem? Or is it because it's not a national, it's not the Jewish people as a whole that are under attack here, it's a particular number of Jews, certain Jewish communities are under attack, but the entire Jewish people is not here, they're not present, they're not in any particular danger at this moment. So is that a different halachic definition? Is it because of Lo Ta'amul Adam Re'echa? Or, well, that's a good question, and I'm not sure I know the exact answer, how to respond to that question. The question has occurred to me, and I've been thinking about this for some time. I'm not sure right now. Okay, I'll look into this some more. Maybe I'll have an answer next time, a more precise and well documented, footnoted answer. But so you could either say it's because of mitzvah, Mechamet mitzvah, Ezrat Yisrael Misal Sheba'alehem. And then that would mean that such a mitzvah, such a mitzvah exists in Chutz La'aretz, even in Bizman Galut, which would be a hidush to say such a thing. And if you wanted to be particularly akum, particularly crooked and naloz in your way of thinking, then you would say, well, in order to do that, you have to have a king first. And so now if you were to say that, then what would you do with Hilchot Shabbat, Perek Sheni in the Rambam, where he says that if this is what happens on Shabbat, you go out and you fight the Goyim. Does it say anything about having a king in that situation? No. The Shulchan Aruch brings this halacha, doesn't say you don't have a king in Poland or in Morocco. So that cannot be said. That's obviously wrong. So whatever the underlying principle is for that halacha, we know the halacha. Whether it's on Shabbat, whether it's in Chutz La'aretz, in Bizman Galut, or today, whatever the case may be, there are many situations which do not involve an individual who is helpless at the mercy of these evil goyim who are trying to force him to transgress the Torah, but rather a national or communal danger, which endangers Rabim Israel. In that situation, clearly Pikuach Nefesh is not a factor. Is not how these things are to be dealt with.
Isn't the example of Mordechai and Esther going to destroying Jews' enemies in Persia? Isn't that an example of Milchamet Mitzvah?
Well, again, I'm not sure it makes a practical difference whether you define it as Milchamet Mitzvah or whether you define it as Lo Ta'amul Adam Re'echa or Lo Ta'amul Adam Atzmecha, whatever the case may be. It's self-evident that a person should defend themselves, and they were given permission by the Persian king at that time to do so, to attack and kill anyone who wished to do them harm, Kol Mevakshei Nafsham, as it says in Megillat Esther, and that's what they did, and they killed well over 75,000 of the Jewish people's enemies, as is explicitly mentioned and enumerated in the Megillah.
One last thing you might want to address. I know that a certain Haredi individual recently gave a shiur in which explained that he himself serves in the army. He's already mid-aged. But he only serves in the army, he says, because of Lo Tamod Al Dam Reach. He doesn't believe that Melchemet Mitzvah applies. And therefore, because of that, he doesn't feel that you can make a claim that every Bachur has to be drafted, because it's not Melchemet Mitzvah, it's only Lo Tamod Al Dam Reach. To me...
So what about the halacha that we read from Yichov Shabbat?
Correct, right.
What about the sugya, the explicit baraita Masechet Eruvin? What does he do? And Rambam said, "Call Yisrael Nesulim to go and help to fight the enemy."
What disturbed me about it is, even if he wants to be stubborn and claim it's not Melchemet Mitzvah, how do you not think that you have to defend the whole country even just based on Lo Tamod Al Dam Reach?
You're obviously correct, and I don't see the necessity to try and understand that line of thinking. The answer is obvious, that the Jewish people are required and commanded to defend themselves wherever they may be to the best of their ability. Usually, in the reality of Galuth, the Jews were not in a position to defend themselves, usually. Even in the Second World War, there were situations where some Jews were able to organize themselves and put up a fight, like the Warsaw Ghetto, for example, and other instances. And that was very correct and very proper in every way, whatever the chances of success may have been. In general, it would be correct to say that when Rambam writes that, just as the Rambam says with regards to building the Mikdash, or Chazal say in the Sifrei, in the Masechet Sanhedrin, the Bavli, Daf Kaf, when Chazal say that Shalosh Mitzvot Nistavu Yisrael B'Sha'at Knisatan La'aretz, and those mitzvot are to be performed in a certain order, namely Melech, Amalek, Bet HaBechira, in that order. Rambam himself writes explicitly in Moreh Nevuchim, which is something that many poskim, many mefarshim did not take note of. Rambam himself says explicitly in Moreh Nevuchim that this only applies b'viyah rishonah, when they first entered Eretz Yisrael. How do I know? Because he says the reason that you need a king to build the Mikdash is so that the Shevatim will not quarrel amongst themselves in whose Shevet, in whose Nahala the Mikdash will be built. And for that you need someone who can say, I'm deciding it's going to be here, and no one, and that's it. You can't. There's nothing, no more discussion. You have to have a melech to have that power and that authority. But once that place has been chosen, we all know, Rambam himself also writes at the beginning of Chol Bet HaBechira, that once that place has been chosen for the Mikdash, it can't be undone, it can't be unchosen. There's no such thing, and you can't choose another place. So the need for a king was fulfilled Bezman Biyah Rishonah, and that explains Mimela why in Bezman Biyah Shniya, in the time of Hazru Min HaGolah, Mit Bavel, they didn't have a king, and yet they built a Mikdash. So there's no question why that's possible, based on what I just quoted from the Rambam. This is in Perek Shlishi of Moreh Nevuchim. I think it's Perek Memhei or something like that. So just as Rambam says with regards to the Mikdash, there's an order to these mitzvot, Melech, Amalek, Mikdash, but the fact is that in many situations a Mikdash can be built. In other words, it did happen, and it's mufurash in Talmud Yerushalmi, as we've mentioned before, Maaser Sheni, Zot Omeret, it says there, Bet HaMikdash Yibaneh, Atid Libanot, I'm sorry, it says Bet HaMikdash Atid Libanot, Kodel Malchut Bet David. So the Mikdash will be or could be built, according to the Sugya, then Maaser Sheni Perek Hamishi, Halacha Bet. The Mikdash can be built before Malchut Bet David, in other words, mashma, without a king. So this all these ideas that people come up with, you pass Masechet Nerilah, you have to also understand. Rav Tzvi the Kook Zetzal was misled by Hagaon Rabbi David Friedman Mikarlin, who wrote in his book Shilat David, in a Kuntres called Kuntres Zion Yerushalayim, or Drishat Zion Yerushalayim, something like that. at the beginning of that contrast, where it says Mechilat here somewhere. We have in Masechet Mechilat Bavli, Daf Yod Zayin Amud Bet, we have the famous Baraita, Tano Rabbanan, speaking about the Shmoneh Esrei, Me'ah Ve'esrim Zekenim Uvahem Kaman Ve'im Tiknu Shmoneh Esrei Barachot. Okay? Then it goes down through the order of the Barachot, Avoth, Gevuroth, Kedushat Hashem, etc. When it gets to Birkat Yerushalayim, it says at the bottom of Daf Yod Zayin Amud Bet, the nusach here is incorrect. It says Kevan shenivnet Yerushalayim ba David. The correct nusach is Kevan shebau Yerushalayim. Kevan shebau Yerushalayim ba David. What's interesting is that if you go through the sugya here, it doesn't actually say when the Mikdash will be built, at what stage, because it talks about Kevan shenitkabesu galuyot na'asa din. It says here Barashaim. But and then it goes on to say, "V'chevan shena'asa din min harashaim." The nusach here is kolel haposheim, kalu haposheim, v'cholel zedim imahem. The real nusach is kalu aminim. That's the real nusach, as it appears in all the accurate sources. And Rashi, he was also heavily censored. Rashi says explicitly it's referring to the early Christians. Kalu aminim, v'cholel zedim. And then it goes on to say, all right, so now the Rishaim are gone, and it talks about Karnoth Sadikim Mitromemeth Birushalayim, and then it says Kevan she'ba'u Yerushalayim ba David. All right, so what about the Mikdash? Doesn't say, because the next statement in the Talmud is in this Baraita on Daf Yod Het is Kevan she'ba David ba'af tefillah. So where's the Mikdash exactly? Rashi says here, the Talmud here quoted the pasuk, Kevan sheba'u Yerushalayim ba David, sheneimar ahar. This is a pasuk in Hosea. Ahar yashuvu bnei Yisrael uvikshu et Adonai Elohehem u'et David Malkam. That's in Hosea Perek Gimel. Rashi says here, ahar yashuvu levet hamikdash uvikshu. I think it might say, it may have to really say in Rashi, not uvikshu, ela yivakshu akadosh baruch hu u'et David Malkam. Either way, Rashi says yashuvu levet hamikdash, and there they will pray for Malchut Hashem and for David HaMelech. All right, so first of all, what does that mean? If once that Rashi says they're in Yerushalayim, ahar yashuvu levet hamikdash. Rashi says it doesn't say that in the Talmud in so many words, but it says Rashi says in so many words, ahar yashuvu levet hamikdash uvikshu or yivakshu hakodesh baruch hu with David Malkam, which means that before there will be a mikdash, before David HaMelech, before Malchut Veit David. So what is Hagaon? Hagaon Atzum Varav. And a ta'ir, how great Rabbi David Friedman Mikalin was. Baki b'chol Torah, mamash. Bavli Yerushalmi, mamash. Atzum Varav. But here he was wrong. Malasot, en malasot. You have to, the truth. En holkim kavod larav. Imkom hilul Hashem. En malasot. He was of the opinion that le'olam, in all times, in all generations, in order to have a mikdash, you first have a melech. And he was there responding to people in his day, about 120 or 30 years ago, who were talking about the possibility of rebuilding the Mikdash then. So, and he was taken aback by this idea. He didn't like this talk at all. So he tried to reject this line of thinking. And he said, that's not possible because you can't have Mikdash without a melech. And then he runs into this Rashi here. So what does he say? He says, this Rashi it has to be, you have to change the wording of Rashi. Ahar yashuvu Yerushalayim uvikshu akadosh baruch hu et David Malkam. In other words, he had to get rid of the words Bet HaMikdash in Rashi in order to fit with his theory, with his understanding. On top of that, he had to do something further. We quoted before the Yerushalmi Ma'aser Sheni, which he of course knew Baal Peh, which he did. We're talking about someone who learned 20 hours a day standing on his feet. Okay, this is someone who knew Bavli Yerushalmi Baal Peh. He knew the Yerushalmi, which says Zot Omeret שעתיד בית המקדש עתיד להיבנות קודם מלכות בית דוד. What does he do with that? He said that's also a mistake. It has to read Yerushalayim instead of Beit Mikdash. So in order to להעמיד את סברתו, he has to מתקן the Lashon of the Yerushalmi, which everyone quotes without suggesting there's a problem with the Lashon, and to change the Lashon of Rashi, and all this כדי להעמיד סברה מסוימת שאינה נכונה. That has no basis. So, מה לעשות? The Ramban writes in his Hakdama into Milhamot Hashem on the Rif, he writes that Talmud and Halacha is not mathematics. In mathematics you can disprove a theorem, an equation, you can show that it's wrong. And it's wrong, it's either right or it's wrong, can't be both. In Halacha, in Torah, usually you cannot prove things in such a mathematical, empirical fashion. But you can show one kushya and another kushya. You can increase the number of kshaim and dehakim that are necessary to maintain a certain position. And you can show that if we adopt a different understanding, a different way of looking at it, these kshaim, these dehakim, these difficulties disappear. And that's the Ramban says, V'zot tachlit ma she'efshar la'asot, when it comes to Talmud Torah. You can show this shita is kashe, v'od yoter kashe, another kushya. And the more you marbeh b'kushyot, that shita nofelet me'elea. That's what you can do. You can't do more than that. אז אני אומר, על אותה דרך, if Rabbi David Bar-Hayim Mikalin, who was to enter the room now, I would stand up and run to him and kiss his feet. But if he tells me that this is the Shita, and in order to ma'amid his Shita, I have to change the Nusach in the Yerushalmi and change the Nusach in Rashi, which everyone for the last 2,000 years, the Yerushalmi and 1,000 years in Rashi have quoted as is, and no one suggests there's a problem. That makes perfect sense. Only to accept this particular notion, אז אני מצטער מאוד, במחילה מכבודך, that can't be correct. פשוט. Harav Sida Cook, surprisingly, accepted this theory of Rabbi David Bar-Hayim Mikalin. So all his students repeat these ideas without thinking about it for a moment. I don't think any of them took notice of the fact that you have to change the Yerushalmi and change Rashi to make it fit your theory. I don't think they did that. Maybe they didn't look into it sufficiently. But that's the fact. No one seems to have noticed this problem. But that's the truth. So, just as Rambam and just as the Yerushalmi tells you that you can have a mikdash without a melech, and just as Bayit Sheni proves that this is what happened, in the same way, yes, and Rabbi David Bar-Hayim Mikalin comes up with another. I think he also noticed that Bayit Sheni didn't work that way. There was no melech, so he says that was a horat sha'av a navi. That's very interesting. Also, where's the horat sha'av? It was a katuv. You know of a horat sha'ah shel navi which is not mentioned anywhere not in the Nevi'im, not in Chazal. As ech yadata minayin lecha. You see how completely impossible such a shita is. So, just as and other mitzvot also, we see that we always have to perform the mitzvot of the Torah to the best of our ability, even if it's not always the ideal in the ideal fashion. Mashal, in the time of the Hashmonaim, in the Torah, it describes the menorah of the Mikdash. Correct? It's made of what? Of gold. Zahav. Miksha achat. A huge amount of gold. Beaten from one piece of gold. If the Greco-Syrians happened to steal to make off with your menorah as they did, when the Hashmonaim were able to reconquer Yerushalayim and the Mikdash, after some years of Jews not being able to access the Mikdash or Yerushalayim, they didn't have a menorah. What did they do? It says Mefurash, Mechilaf Ta'anit. It says it's brought in the Talmud. Rambam brings in the Chod Beit Klei Mikdash, Mefurash, that they built a menorah of pig iron, of barzel, and wood. They cobbled together something made of the simplest, cheapest materials that were available at that time, and that was the menorah until they were able to get enough gold together and create a menorah lechatchila. But b'diavad, that's what they had, and that's what they did. And that's the halacha l'doroth. The dorot, that's the halacha. If you don't have the gold for a menorah, you make a menorah of barzel pashut. This whole approach that many people have towards the Torah, that that we don't know and we can't do it and we're not sure. The same as some people will tell you about Techilith. Some people will tell you, certain Rabbanim will tell you, well, we don't. If you ask, why don't I have Techilith? He will say, maybe some of them will say, I'm not sure it's Techilith which you have. Who said that's Techilith? Well, first of all, I could respond and say, first of all, I've looked into it and I know it is, but and you haven't, and you don't know, therefore, whether it is or is not. So what's the argument about? But let's say you're not sure. You looked into it and it might be, and it might not be Techilith. Why not put it? Why not wear it? If it's Techilith, ma tov. If it's not Techilith, lo kara klum. As yesh b'zeh isur.
I think Rav Sternbach would say it's Baal Tosif.
That's not true. There's no basis for saying that. At the worst, if you deliberately place kala ilan on your beged instead of techileth, that's wrong. That's vaday wrong, asur. But if you think something is techileth and you put it there, and it turns out it's not techileth, lo ifsata shum davar. This is not just my claim. The Rebbe Miradzin, the first of the Chachamim in recent generations to speak about techileth, even though I think his shita, what techileth is completely mistaken, but he writes about this at length, and he says he thought it was the cuttlefish, which it's not. But okay. But he said, even if you're mesupak, even if you think that my tchelet is only maybe tchelet, you should wear it. Misafek minat doraita lechumra. That's what he said. It also works in that direction, not just leisur, also lechiyuv. Until you know it's not, maybe it is. On top of which, if you look into it, you know for a fact that what tchelet is, and it's not the cuttlefish, it's the Murex trunculus, whatever, etc. And here it is. It's right here, and that's it. Pashut. It's all these things. Whether we're talking about Milhemet Miswa, or talking about Hasalat Isra Misar Sheba'alehem, or whether we're talking about Techilith, or whether we're talking about Mikdash, Harabayit, whatever topic you wish to discuss and raise, I will tell you that it all comes down to one thing. It's all about my 10 brick mashal, if you're familiar with the 10 brick mashal. If I give you 10 bricks and I tell you organize them into a circle, everyone knows how to do that, simple. Put them together, join them, they're touching each other, you have a nice circle. If I now give you an 11th brick and I say introduce that into the circle, you can't. You have to first break, undo, deconstruct the circle, and then you can create a larger, expand your circle and add the 11th brick, and then you'll have a circle of 11 bricks, correct? Galuth Mode Judaism, GMJ, is the 10 brick system. And in order to begin working towards the other option, which is also GMJ, Gula Mode Judaism, or Redemption Mode Judaism, RMJ, in other words, Torah Emet, Kifshuta, you have to begin by deconstructing the circle and expanding the circle. You have to add all the misworth, all the aspects of the Torah that were missing in what you thought was Torah, which is really something else called Yiddishkeit. And if you're not willing to do that, then there's no hope for you. And it doesn't matter whether it's an innocuous little blue string like this, which doesn't cost terribly much, and it's a simple thing to do, and no one can claim that you need a melech to put on techilith, and no one can claim that you need the Mashiach, or some people actually have claimed that, but I won't go into that now. That's too inane to even begin to discuss. But some people have claimed Kabbalistic thinking that Techileth will only reappear at the time of the Mashiach, and therefore if it appeared now and it's not the Mashiach's time, so therefore this is not Techileth. That's how their mind works, and that's something which I won't even relate to. It's not worthy of a response, really. And no matter what it is, if you're not willing to accept that you're used to something which is not the real McCoy, something which is very, very an inferior version of Torah, you're not willing to understand and accept that, and therefore begin deconstructing in order to reconstruct, then there's no hope for you with regards to any of these matters, and another 100 which we haven't discussed.